Welcome, and thank you for joining the 2021 Houston Area Parkinson's Society Summer Lecture Series July session. I'm Katelyn, Executive Director of HAPS. Since 1974, HAPS has been the only organization in the area providing comprehensive services to the local Parkinson's community. Our mission remains the same since we started, which is to ensure that no one faces a Parkinson's diagnosis alone. I'm so excited to welcome you to the second session of the 11th annual HAPS Summer Lecture Series. Every year, HAPS hosts this fun, summer-themed educational event, giving us the opportunity to bring local and national experts to provide practical, helpful, and important information about the disease to our Parkinson's community. Due to ongoing considerations related to COVID-19, we decided to keep our educational programs virtual, but we are looking forward to resuming in-person educational events in the coming year. Before we get started today, I have several groups that I would like to thank. First, I would like to thank all of the individuals who make up our Board of Directors, Board of Advisors, and Medical Advisory Board for their ongoing support and the role they play in developing and implementing our programs. I owe a big thank you to the members of the HAPS team for the energy they put into every program and event that HAPS offers. It's because of their efforts that HAPS has been able to maintain and expand our reach and service over the years. Third, I want to offer a sincere thanks to all of our sponsors. We are so fortunate to have so many wonderful community partners in the work that we do. This group has remained steadfast in their commitment to supporting us in the local Parkinson's group and to helping us to ensure the continuation of our mission. So specifically, I'd like to thank our presenting partner, Supernus, as well as AbbVie, Accorda Therapeutics, Boston Scientific, UCB, Amneal, Home Instead Senior Care, Medtronic, Synovian, and Acadia. Additionally, I want to thank our Parkinson's community for joining us today and for being the most important part of the work that we do. And finally, I want to thank our presenters for sharing their time and expertise today, helping us gain a better understanding of the disease and for getting us up and moving after today's lecture. Okay, so real quick, I want to give you a rundown of the day. You will hear from our speaker, Dr. Angela Roberts, who will then join me for a question and answer session after the presentation is finished. But before we join Katelyn Blankenburg for her exciting movement lab featuring drumming. If you do not already have the handouts for today's lecture, you can access them on the HAPS website at hapsonline.org under the Summer Lecture Series section, or by clicking the link that was sent in the email that contained the link to today's webinar. The program includes full presenter bios, upcoming HAPS events and programs, information from our sponsors, and the presentation for today's lecture. There will be a couple of brief breaks while we move to the question and answer portion of the program and before we go to the Movement Lab studio. So I thank you in advance for your patience during this process. And during the question and answer session, we will be addressing the questions that you in the audience submit through the course of today's lecture. So if you're participating in the live session, you have the option to submit questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I'll only be monitoring the Q&A option and won't be monitoring the chat or raise your hand features during today's program. At this time, I would like to introduce you to our speaker for the day. Angela Roberts received her PhD in philosophy from the University of Western Ontario and completed a postdoctoral fellowship in cognitive neurology at the Lawson Health Research Institutes. She is Assistant Professor of Communication Sciences and Disorders in the School of Communication at Northwestern University. Her interests are language and acquired cognitive communication disorders in adults with neurodegenerative disorders, and her widely publicized research includes the neurological and behavioral characterization of language and communication profiles in these populations, in addition to the design and evaluation of therapy interventions and caregiver education programs. She is very well known in the Parkinson's community and speaks to groups around the country. So we welcome Dr. Roberts.
Before I start my slides, I wanted to say what an honor it is to be with you all on this fantastic Saturday. I'm joining you from Chicago area, which is not quite as lovely as Houston, but I have my background hoping to join in with your fun today and welcoming the opportunity to feel like at least I'm in a topical area. I have to also say that it's a privilege to join you today because my husband is I think now 7th or 8th generation Texan. While I am not from Texas, I do consider myself an adopted Texan. And so it's a joy to kind of be back with people that we consider family to us. And so I want to share with you today some of the research that we do in communication challenges in Parkinson's disease, but also really focus on some of the helpful strategies that I hope you'll be able to walk away from today's presentation and implement pretty quickly at home. I'm open to any and all questions around Parkinson's disease when we get to the question period, and I'll answer them as best as I can. So I'm going to move on to share my slides now. Okay. And perfect. Okay. So just want to make sure if you guys can confirm that you can see the slides, and then I'll get us started. So today the focus is on thinking about really more than just kind of speech challenges in Parkinson's disease. I want us to think about focusing on communication and how we cope with communication challenges in Parkinson's disease. And for me, in the work that I do, and you'll see this focus throughout the day, it's more than just the loudness of voice or the variety of vocal patterns that people may be able to generate. It's also things like finding challenges in retrieving the correct word, or being able to engage in conversations with others and keeping up with the pace of conversation. So when I first went back to do my PhD training, and this is something I like to share with the Parkinson's community, the whole reason why, as a speech language pathologist, I decided to leave my career and go back to do research training was purely because of people living with Parkinson's disease. I was working day in and day out in Parkinson's clinics, both in the US and on the Canadian side of my practice, and seeing in the neighborhood of a couple of hundred people a week in those clinics who were living with Parkinson's disease and their families. And every time they would come in, it just became so apparent that the communication challenges and the things that were really giving people burden in their everyday lives went so far beyond the therapies that I had available in terms of just addressing voice loudness or speech clarity. And so this really got me thinking about what are the challenges that people living with Parkinson's disease really face in the communication realm. And now that's led to almost 15 years of research in this area. And so again, I appreciate you having enough interest to have me here with you today. And I hope that I can share with you something interesting and helpful. So a little bit on our disclosure. So we are quite fortunate. A lot of our work is supported by the National Institutes of Health. So that means it's funded by US taxpayers. We operate a research program here at Northwestern University, and I also have a lab on the Canadian side and work closely with my Parkinson's disease colleagues on that side of the border. And so we're funded by programs both in the US and Canada. So as I said today, our learning objectives here really are to think about the importance of communication as a form of connecting, not just as a form of getting messages across. I'm going to focus today not just on people with Parkinson's disease, but also on their care and communication partners. We really want to think about this as a whole unit of people who are communicating with one another. What we have discovered in our work and what I'll share with you today is that people, when they're living in the context of Parkinson's disease, both the person with Parkinson's and their communication partners tend to develop some bad habits around communication. And we're going to try to break some of those bad habits today. So this really is at the outset a focus on the entire family. We're going to talk about how Parkinson's disease affects conversation and social engagement and social communication with a focus on those topics. And then I'm hoping to kind of impart and leave with you today strategies for not just getting, again, messages across, but really creating and maintaining connections using effective communication. But I want to start today by going over kind of a recent study that came out. And so this is a bit of a beyond Parkinson's disease slide, but I think it's important to share with this community. So this is what this figure comes from the Lancet 2020 report on dementia risk factors and prevention. And one of the reasons why I raise this is people with Parkinson's disease are at elevated risk of developing dementia because they have Parkinson's disease. But really all of us around the world, we have this kind of increased risk for developing dementia due to changes in lifestyles and vascular risk factors. But people with Parkinson's disease have this added risk. And so one of the things that we think about in these Lancet reports that they release about every 3 to 5 years is what this Commission on Aging does is go through and look at all of the risk factors for people living in the world. And they look at if there were things that we could address, how could we reduce the risk of developing dementia or cognitive impairment just by addressing those risk factors. And so what it gets down to the core of is that developing cognitive issues in the context of Parkinson's disease, or if you're a person who is living in the care community with someone who has Parkinson's disease, but you don't have PD, how do you also reduce your risk of developing dementia? And we think about this because we want to try to address those targetable risk factors, whether you have PD or not, that would lessen your risk. And so one of the things that comes out that's really relevant to the work that we do is that if we addressed all of these factors, all of these kind of issues that are on this list, so education, hearing loss, traumatic brain injury, we could actually reduce the risk of developing dementia by 40%. Now, 40% is a lot if you're considering a community that doesn't have Parkinson's disease, but 40% is giant if you're in a community with Parkinson's disease, where we automatically expect the risk for cognitive decline to be a little bit higher. So I want to address some of the factors on this particular Lancet report that are relevant to some of the other topics I'll be talking about today. One of the first is hearing loss. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this in the context of my presentation, but managing hearing loss is also really important for communication, and I am going to be talking about that function. But if we treat hearing loss, then we have an actual ability to kind of reduce the risk of dementia by as much as 8%. And this becomes important in Parkinson's disease specifically, because amongst all the things that we know that Parkinson's disease does in terms of affecting movement and mobility and speech and voice, there's also this growing body of research that shows that people with Parkinson's disease happen to also be at increased risk for hearing loss. In fact, they may be as much as 20 to 25% higher risk for developing hearing loss compared to people of the same age who do not have Parkinson's disease. And so here, hearing loss is something that we think about that not only aids in conversations and in communication, but it also may support a reduction in the risk of developing dementia. And so I wanted to raise that for this group in particular because of this growing risk factor that we know around Parkinson's disease and hearing loss. Physical activity is something, and that's the red circle at the bottom, that we really emphasize in Parkinson's disease. And so the exercise program that we'll have this morning is kind of part of that. But so are all the other fantastic exercise programs that are being developed by researchers and clinicians for people with Parkinson's. But one of the factors we don't pay as much attention to really is this kind of concept of social isolation in Parkinson's disease. And there's a recent article, and I'll spend some time talking about it today, that highlights the role of speech and communication challenges in PD specifically as being part of these factors that contribute to social isolation for people with Parkinson's disease. And again, this is important for two reasons. It's important for quality of life for people living with PD, but we also link it to this reduction in dementia risk. And so I wanted to kind of begin the day with this today to kind of give you some of the most current research on managing cognitive impairments and reducing kind of risk factors. But I wanted to also highlight that kind of overlap with Parkinson's disease and how we need to really try to pinpoint some of these risk reduction strategies to support overall cognitive health, but specifically cognitive health in those living with PD. And so one of the things that I'll highlight here is that we communicate, if we kind of do this transition into thinking about, okay, we're going to try to get ourselves more socially engaged and we're going to work on our speech, then how do we really think about communication on whole? And communication is this thing that we do with our whole body. So we communicate with our eyes and our hands, our speech, we communicate through hearing. And what's really kind of challenging when we're in this Parkinson's disease space is that both the motor and non-motor symptoms of Parkinson's disease have this larger impact on social communication because it actually does affect all of the channels that we use for communicating. So you heard me just talk about the fact that we think people with Parkinson's disease now might be at higher risk for hearing loss. And we know that Parkinson's disease affects our ability to use our body and our facial expressions, and I'll be talking about that more today. And Parkinson's disease also affects our speech. So when we're really thinking about these motor and non-motor symptoms and their contributions to our ability to engage and communicate socially with others, they're pretty substantial. And so in the Parkinson's disease space, we find reduced facial and vocal expression, reduced ability to use body language. Speech becomes quieter and it might become more hoarse, or you might actually become more fatigued when talking. So you might not have the same endurance for having longer conversations. Difficulty retrieving words is really normal in Parkinson's disease, and people get sometimes afraid that this is a first symptom of dementia. But we know that just having Parkinson's itself can make it a little bit more challenging to retrieve the correct word that you want to use, something that we tend to call tip of the tongue phenomenon. These theory of mind changes, that's a big term that simply means that in a conversation, your ability to kind of read the intentions of other speakers in that conversation becomes more challenging. When we're conversing with others, we actually have this kind of secret power as human communicators. We actually are able to kind of mind read our partners. You're not aware that you're doing it, but we certainly are doing it on an ongoing basis. In fact, you actually know what your partner, your conversation partner is going to say several seconds, upwards of 30 or 40 seconds sometimes before they even say it. So there's this, what we call sometimes shared perspective across speakers that we frame as this theory of mind perspective. And people with Parkinson's disease can have difficulty maintaining train of thought. They have difficulty recognizing emotions. We're going to talk about all of these kind of processes today in a bit of detail, and then what are some strategies that you can do to work around them. So when I'm thinking about communication challenges in Parkinson's disease, and I said to you all, this was one of the things that really drove me back to kind of do my PhD and start a research career. It was because in my life, people were really just focusing on these speech clarity issues, but it was quite clear that there was so much else going on with the disease that was affecting people's quality of life through their ability to communicate. And so this recent paper by Pranger and colleagues is specifically in Parkinson's disease. And one of the things that they do in this paper is review the kind of literature that's out there on communication challenges with people with Parkinson's disease. And this paper is actually written by a neurology team, a clinical neurologist. And one of the things that they write about is that these communication changes have this real ability to make people with Parkinson's disease feel stigmatized, to remove aspects of the perception of their humanity, this thing we call dehumanization, to where they feel as if they might be in a room and others may not see them for who they really are. And it can also lead to withdrawal and social isolation and loneliness. Now, people who are living with Parkinson's disease may have awareness of these feelings already, and I don't raise them to be a downer or to create a negative perspective. But I raise them so that those who are listening in today, who may not be the person living with Parkinson's disease, begins to gain an appreciation for how these communication changes can have such a broader impact on not just kind of how hard or easy it is to get things done in one's daily life, but these more internal perspectives of personhood and acknowledging a person for who they are, that it goes so much deeper than just difficulty getting words out or difficulty being heard by others. But we're a Parkinson's community, and what that means is we don't know the word can't. So one of the things I have learned over years of working in the Parkinson's disease community, having the privilege and honor of working with people and their families, and also having Parkinson's disease in my own family, I know that there is no can't in this disease. And if there's ever a group of people who can do it and find a way to do it, it's this community. And so what I want to focus on for the rest of today is how can we do it? How do we get past some of these challenges in partnership with those around us to improve communication, to aid in reducing that risk factor around social isolation, and to keep ourselves connected with those around us. Okay, so let's take this first kind of jump into what is this thing we call facial masking or hypomania. And so hypomania is the term that we use kind of on the neurology side as the symptom, one of the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. And what it really means is this reduced ability to kind of spontaneously generate facial expressions. And this word spontaneous is important. It's not that people with Parkinson's disease cannot smile to the same degree that they did before, or they don't have the same degree of facial movement if we really ask them to smile largely or wrinkle their nose. There's not a weakness problem in the muscles of the face. But what there is a reduced ability to respond naturally and spontaneously when you are engaging with others. So here's what we do in a conversation. When we're conversing with other people, as I said, you're constantly reading their facial expressions, you're constantly reading their mind in a way, and your own facial expressions respond in reaction to those around you. We call this mimicry. And so hypomania is the reduced ability to do that natural mimicry that is very automatic in humans. And so this loss of or inability or challenges in the spontaneous generation of facial expressions really is that. It's the challenge being able to respond spontaneously to the emotions of others that are arising in conversation. So what this means is that people with Parkinson's disease may often be viewed as having less realistic smiles. And sometimes that can lead others around them to believe that they're angry when they're not, or that they're not interested when they're actually very interested. It may give them the perception of being withdrawn or cold when that's anything but the truth. In fact, one of the folks that we work with a lot in my research lab, he's someone who sits on our patient advisory board and contributes to all of our studies. One of the things that he constantly reminds me of about this fact is that he struggles even with his own grandchildren, that his own grandchildren sometimes have difficulty reading his emotional expressions. And that makes him feel as if he's disconnected from them. And so this is an area of research we've been trying to focus more on. And so one of the things that this kind of extends to is this disruption in empathy and the pleasure response that's driven in the other person that you're talking with. So as I said, these are all natural and spontaneous and human. We're doing this in a very automatic way. And just as people with Parkinson's disease may have challenges emotionally reacting to others, indeed, other people may have not the same emotional feel good from those interactions. And so one of the things we have to remember is despite this mimicry problem, despite this hypomania piece, this does not actually affect the ability to feel emotions. And this is where conversation partners of people with Parkinson's disease have to be really tuned in. The inability to express emotions is not the same as not feeling those emotions. And this is super, super central to communication challenges in PD because we do a tremendous amount of communicating through our body and through our faces. A lot of, in fact, our communication happens through our body and facial expressions. So in addition to this kind of challenge maybe in expressing one's own emotions, we can also see that people with Parkinson's disease have some challenges processing emotions in others. We tend to see this be a little bit worsened when people are in their off medication state. So for example, a number of studies have looked at whether or not people with Parkinson's disease are able to read facial expressions as easily and find that they can have challenges reading particularly or understanding particularly emotions such as anger and sadness. And so one of the ways that we, think about this is, gosh, if it's just the visual representation of the emotion, then what about vocal cues or a happy voice versus a sad voice? But we also see that Parkinson's disease can affect the ability to read cues from the voice as well as cues from the face that convey emotions. So then we're back in this emotional space of how do we get around this, right? So if I'm having difficulty expressing myself through my voice, expressing my emotions through my face, and even maybe processing emotions through others, facial expressions and vocal expressions, then I have to really think about how do I express myself through all channels of my body? How do I make sure that my eyes and my voice and my ears are hearing and my gestures are really amping up what my emotions are? And so this is indeed one of the strategies that we teach in my lab, is thinking about not just using your voice to express emotions, not just using your gestures or your body language to express emotions, but combining across these channels to make sure your message is really clear. So we say communicate with your whole body. Both say and show what you mean and state your emotions really explicitly. So if you're happy, say, gosh, that makes me really happy. Don't just depend on your facial expressions to say that for you. If you're sad, let people know I'm really sad. And there are some treatments like the Lee Silverman voice treatment that may actually help with these facial and vocal expressions of emotions, because they simply kind of help to add the irks or to give more energy behind those expressions. There are lots of facial exercise programs that people do. These help to keep the muscles a little bit more limber and moving. They may or may not help with that ability to spontaneously respond to emotions, but they certainly don't hurt. But at the end of the day, we don't have a tremendous amount of treatments for kind of really addressing these more emotional expression challenges in Parkinson's disease, other than to really help people think about layering on this information. And again, for us, this most effective strategy is to both show through your gestures, but also say explicitly the emotions that you're feeling in a moment in time. And what we try to teach care partners is that if you're not sure about what your partner means when they are talking to you or expressing an emotion, then just ask. If you think they're angry, ask if they're angry, and give the person with Parkinson's disease the opportunity to say, gosh, no, I'm not angry. I'm really actually excited about this. And it's important for communication partners to realize that there's a value in communicating through all channels. We have to train ourselves as partners who are communicating with people who have Parkinson's disease to value both the emotional words that say I'm angry or sad, the facial expressions, as well as the gestures, watching the eyes, watching for multiple kind of signals or channels of emotional expression. And then I think it's also really important that we as partners of people with PD work to educate others so that they understand that even though, my partner's facial expressions may not convey everything that he means to convey, he actually is feeling all those emotions and he is very human, and don't stigmatize him because the way he communicates emotions are not the same. So we think this is a two-pronged approach, teaching people with Parkinson's disease to communicate with their whole body as well as their words, but also teaching partners how to read multiple channels of communication around emotions and how to scaffold or work with their partner to make sure others understand these challenges. And so in this realm of the kind of visual elements or the emotional elements of communication, we spend a lot of time working with people to learn these strategies. The communication changes in Parkinson's disease, and I don't have to share this with this audience, are more than even just the hypomania. That's just an area that we're doing more and more research on. But for years, we've known that reduced volume of voice, so not being able to be loud enough, challenges retrieving words, a tendency to make more grammatical errors when producing sentences, and this less fluent speech where people need to revise words or may have more pauses in their speech, that all of these are kind of characteristics of the communication changes in Parkinson's disease. In some of our own work, we've actually looked at ways that people with Parkinson's disease convey ideas or information when they're talking, and find that it's also less productive. Now, these are not changes that we see in the context of people with Parkinson's disease who have cognitive issues or who have dementia. These are just the everyday routine challenges in people living with Parkinson's disease, but we don't talk about it a lot. So when you go to see your movement disorders neurologist, they may listen to your voice volume and ask if you're having more difficulty being heard by others, but they may not as often ask if you're having trouble finding words, or trouble keeping your train of thought, or trouble following conversations and processing information quickly. But these are normal symptoms of Parkinson's disease, and they're important to raise to your physician so that she or he actually understands the complexity of the challenges that you're having. They're also really important to mention to your speech language pathologist, because as I'll talk about here in a few minutes, we have more and more treatments to say that we can do something about these challenges. In fact, about 80 to 90% of all people will experience some of these changes in voice and speech. And so we believe it's really important that people with Parkinson's disease learn how to advocate for themselves, that just because voice volume may not be your primary issue, your voice may generally be loud enough, that these other issues are just as important to kind of raise in your routine appointments and to advocate for services that might be helpful for you. So we're going to think a little bit about some of these speech and voice exercise programs, and I'm going to walk you through some that are well established and some that are a little bit more novel as we come into newer research that's being done for people with Parkinson's disease. And I like to say now is a super exciting time if for communication and speech challenges with in Parkinson's and Parkinson's care space. So when I first started this journey, as I said, around 15 years ago, in terms of the research realm, there was not a lot of research out there about treatments for communication in people who have Parkinson's, with the exception of the tremendous work that's been done with the Lee Silverman Voice Treatment Program, where there's decades of research showing its effectiveness. But that's kind of where it stopped. But I will say over the last 5 to 6 years, there's a ton more work that's being done to really think about new and different ways for addressing speech, voice, and communication problems in Parkinson's disease. So much so that we've actually been asked to kind of write a chapter in a medical textbook on kind of communication and cognition changes in Parkinson's disease more broadly, and the treatments that are available for these challenges through a much broader lens. And so when we get asked to write chapters like that for neurology textbooks, then you know it's starting to get out to the physicians that there's much more that can be done to support all of you on this call in terms of supporting and being better at communication. So we think we're really at an incredibly promising time in Parkinson's disease research, where our understanding of these communication challenges is broadening, and thus the treatments that will become available over the next several years will also begin to broaden. But as I said, one of the kind of still stalwart treatments really are those treatments that are designed to address increased loudness and increased voice effort. And among those, and I know there's speak out programs and a whole bunch of new programs that are coming online. The Lee Silverman Voice Treatment Program really still has the largest amount of evidence that shows that it's effective for doing a couple of things, both raising voice loudness, reducing fatigue when talking by helping to support vocal effort, and also for affecting facial expressions and the amount of kind of variability in one's voice that helps to support being able to convey emotions and thoughts and ideas through vocal expression. And so it's a very highly structured, I'm sure some of you have been through this program, intensive exercise program. And what it's intended to do, it's this kind of very systematic approach for recalibrating voice loudness. There's an online version to the program, as well as an in-person version of the program. And many speech language pathologists who work with people who have Parkinson's disease are familiar with this treatment. But some of the newer interventions that are coming on board also include things like singing and vocal choral singing therapies. These are thought to primarily work by improving both the amount of kind of breath support that you have for speech. They can also help to reduce vocal fatigue so that you don't get so tired when talking. They have limited improvements in voice quality though. So if your voice is hoarse and that's something that bothers you, these treatments haven't been shown to necessarily affect that. They do a little bit of work in terms of increasing loudness, but overall their primary improvement is kind of in that increasing respiratory support and reducing vocal fatigue. So one of the challenges that has been around for a long time with therapy, such as the Lee Silverman voice treatment, is that sometimes for some people it doesn't work. And this is true really for any intervention. It's not a weakness of Lee Silverman, but across any intervention, it's really challenging to find one therapy that absolutely works for everybody. But for years, we did not have any alternative therapies to Lee Silverman. So now, again, Speak Out is kind of another therapy that works on increased vocal effort across a variety of exercises that are a little bit more natural and a little bit more typical of everyday communication activity. So that's one option. But another option here is something that we call Speech 5. And the Speech 5 intervention was developed in part by my colleague, Jessica Huber at Purdue University. And one of the things that Speech 5 does that is different from traditional exercise programs is it aids in making the voice louder so that you get practice and you can exercise the muscles used in speech and voice production, but without having to do the cognitive effort of thinking about being loud. And so for some people, that thinking about being loud is actually really tough. And that can be more challenging for people who have cognitive impairments, but it can also just be more challenging for folks that are having trouble focusing and cognitively pushing that effort all the time. And so that is kind of one of the concerns with Lee Silverman is it requires that kind of meta ability to do that. And for some people, they have found that challenging. So Speech 5 was in a response to that. And what it does is actually use a device that's a little bit like a hearing aid in its shape and form. But when you're talking and your voice becomes too low, it triggers the playing of a background, what we call multi-talker babble. It sounds a little bit like a cocktail party in your ear. And by playing that noise, it acts on an automatic reflex that we as humans have and that is relatively preserved in people with Parkinson's disease, where we try to talk above background noise. So if you go into a room and you're at a party and there's lots of people talking, by default, you're going to try to make your voice louder above that background noise. So that almost reflexive, it's not fully a reflexive activity, but that reflexive response to make your voice louder over the background noise is preserved in Parkinson's disease, even if your voice cannot get loud enough to cover that background noise. And so what this device does is play on that natural reflexive response. So when your voice gets too low, it plays this background cocktail party noise, and then you push your voice above that loudness. And that pushing is what actually helps to exercise the muscles that are used in speaking. So your respiratory muscles, the muscles that we use for closing and opening, the laryngeal muscles for helping to increase pressure and push your voice out, the ability to kind of open your jaw a bit more, but it does this in this much more automatic way where you're not having to think so much about it because it's playing on this reflexive response. And so people wear the device and then they go home and they talk as they would. They practice wearing the device 30 minutes a day. You can wear the device when you're exercising or when you're not exercising your voice. And then over time, the speech language pathologist adjusts the device so that it's making it more and more challenging for you. So you're having to work harder and harder to raise your voice, and that's part of the exercise. One of the benefits of this device, as I said earlier, is that Speech 5 actually has been a good alternative for people who don't necessarily respond as well to Lee Silverman because of the amount of effort it takes to think about being loud for some people. Ideally, Lee Silverman becomes automatic. but it does not necessarily do that for all folks. And so this device, particularly for people who have cognitive impairments with Parkinson's disease, is something we've used to help with voice loudness. So it's both a component of an exercise program, but it's also something that you can wear when you need to be louder and you may have more difficulty doing that. So you can also wear it in specific context. So this is kind of one of those examples. I'm not here promoting Speech 5 in any way, shape, or form, but it's an example of how we're starting to push beyond traditional models of speech therapy interventions for people with Parkinson's disease to really kind of say, let's create more interventions so that there's an intervention for everybody. And so we have this converging evidence. We're now getting research on communication, voice, and speech issues using animal model research. So some of that work's done at the University of Wisconsin in some beautiful, elegant work in Parkinson's disease. Others of it we're getting from the human side. But what we now know, more so than ever, is that we can train specific muscle groups in Parkinson's disease, and that is effective for helping people to maintain a better quality of speech loudness, respiratory effort, lack of fatigue when talking, clarity of the speech sounds when you're talking. And so we now know, and we have ample evidence that training specific muscle groups works. We know that training intensity matters. And so people tend to do better and make more recovery in programs that are intense. And by intense, we mean practicing every day and perhaps even having therapy sessions every day for several weeks until your system gets recalibrated to this new loudness level. But it means practice matters, and in lots of practice matters, and repetitive practice matters. We also have some emerging evidence that says even starting therapies early when the problems may be mild, may be ideal. And so for years, and this is still lots of times the case in Parkinson's disease care, we wait until people's voice and speech problems are really impaired before we put speech pathology services in place. And we're getting evidence that that may not be the best path. The best path may actually be to start early, to build strength in these muscle systems, and that may actually support maintaining good voice quality and speech clarity for longer periods of time. The animal models show us that targeted and intensive voice training may potentially slow the progression of voice impairments in Parkinson's disease. And we also have evidence that intensive loudness training, so some of these programs I'm talking about, whether it's LSVT or things like Speech 5, and a lot of this work has been largely done with LSVT, does actually change the brain activity toward more normal patterns of voice and speech production for people with Parkinson's disease. So this is where the excitement is coming from for us. We're starting to really get this convergence of science. It says no longer should we be waiting until the very severe stages of voice and speech problems to refer people for therapy. We think referring early matters. And we think these intensive interventions actually can have good effects at all stages of the disease. And yet I will say to you that referring people for speech language pathology services is still really low for people with Parkinson's disease. So we did a study that was published earlier this year. We looked at 5,020 people over, I think 15 Parkinson's disease clinics around the world. And we looked at people who were referred to speech language pathology services. So remember I said 80 to 90% of people with Parkinson's disease will have changes in communication. I just got done saying to you, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about the stuff we can do that actually helps to make these problems better and easier for living with. And yet when we looked at 5,020 people across this huge number of clinics, and these were Parkinson's disease expert clinics, these were not just regular neurology clinics, less than 20% of them had actually been referred to speech language pathology services. That's abysmal in our eyes. And so it is up to us as a Parkinson's community to really begin to advocate for ourselves, to say, nope, we've got answers here, and we've got treatments, and we can be flexible. And we need to be getting these services in the hands of people with Parkinson's disease who can make use of them. So I'm going to change gears here just a little bit away from just speech and voice, because as I said, there's so much more going on to the communication problems that we see. And I want to take a pause here to kind of talk about conversation specifically. And this is going to be the kind of wrapping up section of the talk here as we land on what are ways, as we get beyond just thinking about speech and voice, we can actually aid in this exchange of or connecting with people through conversation. And I want to define for you what conversation is. And I know this seems kind of intuitive, but I think it's important for us to spend a bit of time here, because our ability to converse with other humans is uniquely human. So there have been studies that have shown animal model work and people communicating mother orangutans with baby orangutans, and all that's true. There is this connecting thing that happens through communication, even in animals. But this aspect of conversation is uniquely human. We actually begin learning how to have a conversation at birth. The moment you make contact between a mother and a baby or a father and a baby, the minute they start to make eye contact with one another, that's the beginning of how we learn how to have a conversation. Because conversation really is this interaction between two or more people. It's not just a mechanism that we use to convey information, but it's how we as humans fundamentally establish and maintain relationships. And we begin that at that very first moment of us arriving in this world. When it fails, and when it fails specifically in Parkinson's disease, we see those challenges associated with lower quality of life. There's a lot of work that's been done on this out of the UK Parkinsons community that shows that when conversation challenges begin to arise, that people with Parkinson's disease suffer from lower quality of life, as do their communication partners. We know it aligns with increased caregiver burden. So the more challenging these conversations are, the higher the likelihood of people who are care partners rating their caregiver burden as being higher. It creates difficulty in completing everyday activities. And as we've already been talking about throughout the day, it can lead to increased social isolation and loneliness. We spend a lot of time in this space in my lab. We spend a lot of time recording videos from in people's homes between they and their care partners and trying to understand what are these patterns of conversation breakdown. So what goes wrong when things break down? And one of the things that we've discovered is about 2/3 of all conversation breakdowns, so when the message doesn't get across right, are actually unrelated to speech clarity and voice. They've got nothing to do with voice loudness. They've got nothing to do with speech clarity. But what they are behaviors that emerge, such as long pauses. So when you pause too long in a conversation, then your partner has difficulty knowing whether or not it's their turn to speak or whether or not you're continuing to talk. And that leads to people jumping in and this kind of lack of coordination across partners in terms of taking turns. Slow response time, use of incorrect or ambiguous words, interrupting or over talking the person with Parkinson's disease. This is one of those bad habits I've talked about that care partners can develop, this need to jump in too quickly. And it's a need to try to help their partner with Parkinson's disease, but what it does is actually end up disrupting the conversation because it disrupts the person with Parkinson's disease from being able to finish their idea or thought. And it may actually lead to this, what we call overtalk behavior, when two people are talking at one time. And so in our observations, we find these problems are pretty complex. So here's an example of one of them. The person with Parkinson's disease, that's represented here as PDS, says he's told been down, not quite. And his partner here, which is represented by the conversation partner, says, huh? The person with Parkinson's disease says the screw. He was told he could bend and make the screws will come out. So the person with Parkinson's disease here knows exactly what he wants to say, but he's having trouble getting his words out and in the right order. And his care partner says they're going to take him out. So she tries to repair and he gives it one more go. No, they could come out if you put too much weight on it. Finally, the care partner goes, I got it. Oh yeah, they'll fail. So this entire context, which should have been an exchange that lasted about 10 seconds, actually lasted about 4 minutes. And what we see at the end of the video is the care partner just gets up and walks away because she's frustrated. This is common in Parkinson's disease conversations. I don't know about those of you on this call, but the people we work with experience this a lot. And this person does not, the person with Parkinson's disease does not have dementia. In fact, he's about 57 years old. He's great, doing well, exercising every day. But in this moment, he's having trouble getting his ideas together. And it resulted in what we call a trouble source or a conversation breakdown. So we're working with families on this, and we actually have a treatment program we've developed for people with Parkinson's disease. One of the first things that we start reminding people of is that communication is both transactional and interactional. So transactional communication and conversation are those things that we do to exchange messages, right? Just to get information across. But interactional is how we connect with the other person. And interactional communication can occur even when the message is unclear. Now, it's important to remember that as human communicators, we both do transactional and interactional communication. We kind of switch and vacillate between those two all day long. But in the context of living with Parkinson's disease, and especially as the disease can become more severe, what we see when we're in people's homes is as those conversations become much more transactional and much less interactional. So remember, there's supposed to be a balance between the two. So part of what we try to restore within the treatment programs that we do is helping dyads, and that's a person with Parkinson's disease, and their conversation partner, their primary conversation partner. It could be a friend or a family member. We try to help remind them that this balance is important. So it's a-okay for the message to not come across clearly all the time. As long as there's respect in the interaction, the gist is understood, and that moment, the priority around that moment is just connecting with someone, not necessarily having clarity of message. This is one of the first things that we teach. We teach people to set up for success. So when you first go into a room, you want to reduce distractions. Turn the TV off, turn the radio off. You want to make sure that the lighting is ideal. You ideally want to sit in front of it. You can sit beside someone, but if you're sitting beside someone, make sure you can see their facial expressions. And you want to sit no further than 4 to 6 feet apart. Remember, early on today, I talked about the need to communicate with one's whole body. And so if you're a conversation partner of someone with Parkinson's disease, you want to make sure you can see their mouth. You want to see their body language, their full facial expressions, and you want to be sitting close enough that things like hearing or background noise does not get in the way of the communication moment. You want to make sure you have glasses and hearing aids on. As I said before, this hearing piece is something we're really starting to learn more about in Parkinson's disease. If you wear hearing aids, you want those on. We talk about the need to kind of be in tune with yourself, your partner, and the environment. So you want to choose times of day carefully for when to have important conversations. You want to choose those around medication times or fatigue times. Do not start an intensive conversation about where the family is going for vacation when someone's in their off medication state and they're really perhaps tired. So you want to time the conversations appropriately. When conversing, and we say this to both the person with Parkinson's disease as well as their family members, make sure to check in on your own emotions. Right? Is your purpose in having this conversation to just connect with your partner emotionally? Or is it that you really got to discover what's the flight that you're going to take to the family vacation? But you've got to know what those intentions are. What the intention should never be is to test. Conversation is not for testing memory. Conversation is not for testing whether someone recalls what the doctor said. Conversation is not for testing whether or not someone can make their voice loud enough. Conversation is about information sharing and connecting. It's not about testing. So you want to kind of constantly monitor, right, your own emotional state. You want to monitor what your intent is. And you want to always remember that if you've understood the basic message, it doesn't have to be perfect for it to still be meaningful. We talk a lot around teaching partners, and we have, I'm going over this somewhat quickly, but we do this over 10 to 12 weeks of sessions where we work with people on learning how do they negotiate preferences with one another. How does a care partner learn how to best support the person with Parkinson's disease in providing information when they might have trouble finding a word or not being able to be loud enough? And this requires some conversations, actually talking about how you want to be helped and the type of help that you want from others when it comes to communicating. And we believe in teaching people to work as a partnership with those around them. So for example, one of the strategies we teach is we teach care partners how to hold a place in the conversation for the person with Parkinson's disease. So if you know your person is having challenge coming up with the words that they want to use, or it's taking them more time to process what's going on in the conversation because there's a lot of speakers or background noise, then you as their partner can say, you know what, John had this great idea last week on how to redo the deck. I'd love for him to be able to tell you more about that. John, honey, why don't you tell them what we were talking about last week? So you may very well know that that's something that's going to come up in the conversation, and your ability to mark that time allows your partner added opportunity to formulate what she or he wants to say to be able to get it out on the table. Because otherwise, if you're not there to facilitate their participation, or the person with Parkinson's disease isn't able to say, hey, wait, I've got something I want to add here, but it's going to take me a moment to get my idea out. If we don't mark those places in conversation and hold that spot, what often happens is the person with Parkinson's disease can get left out of the conversation, and then they just end up withdrawing and withdrawing and withdrawing and becoming more of a listener than an active participant. And we talk about the importance of making sure that everybody around the person with Parkinson's disease realizes it's their job to help reveal competence and to validate their expertise. So I'm going to jump through a couple of strategies here, and I'm going to hit them at a very high level because they're also in your packet, but these are just some techniques that we teach people in our clinic. We talk about providing additional time. We make sure that when you're having a conversation between you and a person with Parkinson's disease, or the person with Parkinson's disease, your ability to request extra time is just to make sure that everybody's giving an understanding that there's a little bit of lag in how people are going to process information, and people are going to need more time. So be patient. Provide extra time for processing information, and provide extra time so the person with Parkinson's disease has a chance to formulate what they want to say and get it out. We talk about being careful with managing topics. So you don't want to change topics quickly here. You want to give your partner time to adjust, and you want to introduce the topic. You know, so if you're talking about planning the family vacation, and I am the worst at this, in terms of you're talking about planning the family vacation, but then you're going to talk about what's for dinner tonight, but that's really just kind of an interrupter to finishing talking about the family vacation. You don't want to do that. Talk about the family vacation, finish that topic, and then talk about what's for dinner. And if you're a person with Parkinson's disease, this is equally important, because if you're jumping topics, it will also make it really easy, really challenging for people to follow you. You want to provide what we call back channel prompts. When you're talking to someone, whether you have PD or you are a person communicating with someone who has PD, you want to give them nods. You want to use your facial expression to say, yeah, I've got you. I understand what you're saying. I'm following this. That back channel feedback is really, those are important signals for us as communicators to know that the messages are getting across. And without them, it can be rather disconcerting to conversation partners and lead to breakdowns. You want to make sure you're giving lots of that feedback. You want to ask for clarification when needed. Did I understand you? We encourage people, especially now in this virtual environment, to keep black markers handy and index cards handy so that you have them pre-printed out with things like slow down, or I cannot hear you, or wait, I have a question, or wait, I want to say something. Because it can be challenging to get those words out quickly when you have Parkinson's. Having these already written down on flashcards that you can pop up to the screen that tell somebody, okay, wait, we've got to slow down here, can be really helpful. But inevitably, conversation breakdowns are going to happen. The message isn't going to get across the way that we intended it, or the emotion is not going to be understood. And when we've looked at these in Parkinson's disease dyads, we actually see that challenges repairing those breakdowns. So every time a conversation breaks down, we as humans try to repair it. We're hardwired to do that. What we find in the research that we've done is that care partners, this is not a blame care partner space, but that care partners with Parkinson's disease are much more likely to abandon those repair attempts than even partners of people who are living with Alzheimer's dementia. And so what we do spend some time on in our interventions is kind of teaching partners of people with PD how to help repair these cycles. So we teach them to monitor for signals of conversation breakdowns, look for facial expressions or slow response times, or even language that doesn't seem to align with the previous turn, anything that gives you an idea that someone's not understanding. And we teach people to ask for these direct requests for help. I don't think I understood you. Could you repeat that again? And this is even true for the person with Parkinson's disease. If you did not understand or you need more time, say, I need more time. Could you repeat that, please? I didn't get the last word. You can repeat and simplify the information. You can rephrase or add new information. And again, we talk about this importance of using gestures, using your body and your face and your words to say what you mean. But of all things, stay calm and avoid being critical. What not to do, don't raise your voice. That is really ineffective. Even if you think someone has a hearing loss, raising the voice actually makes it harder to understand, not easier to understand. It distorts the signal. And when you raise your voice, you get kind of this angry, sour look on your face. And so it further affects the ability to convey information accurately. The example I showed you earlier where the care partner was going, what, huh? That is not good conversation behavior. What you don't want to do, whether you're the person with Parkinson's disease or the care partner, are you things like what, huh, and A. I'm Canadian, so I have to have A in there. But that's not what you want to do, right? Because that's not a specific request of what wasn't understood. What you can say is, I didn't understand that last word. Or did you mean to say Barbados? I think you said Barbados, but I'm not sure if I understood that correctly. And so you want to give very specific places. If you're asking for clarification, you want to be specific about what you did not understand. And you want to be persistent. And if necessary, you can give up and walk away and come back when time is better, but you don't want to abandon the attempt altogether. If someone is communicating, whether you're the person with Parkinson's disease or you're the care partner communicating, that's important. And you always want to make sure that you come back to ensure that that connection is maintained by respecting and validating one another and putting in the effort it takes to resolve that communication moment, even though it's frustrating and even though you may need to walk away and come back later. So if you take home some takeaways as I wrap up this morning, we have lots of tools to support better communication in PD. And whether you're talking about traditional treatments for speech and voice loudness, whether you're talking about new treatments that are focusing on high effort and exercise, but using a variety of communication tasks, whether you're talking about choir groups, whether you're talking about device-mediated interventions like Speech 5, whether you're talking about the types of conversation strategy and communication strategy training that we do in my lab, the point is we have a lot of tools now on board for people with communication problems who have PD because we understand the problems better. And it likely will take a combination of all of those tools in the toolbox to make the problem better. And not every tool is going to work in every context every time, nor does everyone need every tool, but we need to be better at understanding how do we get tools in the hands of clinicians and in the hands of people living with Parkinson's disease and their families so that they have access to the tools that they need when they need them. Patience and persistence are absolutely key. And it's so critical to know that just because something doesn't work today doesn't mean it's not going to work tomorrow. But this being an advocate for your person with Parkinson's disease and you as the person with Parkinson's disease advocating for yourself, saying, be patient. I'm doing the best I can here, and we've got lots of tools we can use, but sometimes they're going to work, sometimes they're not. But if we're all patient and persistent, we'll get a long way. And it takes a partnership. This is always this drive home point for me at the final is to say, this is not just a problem with the person who has Parkinson's disease. It's not. Their voice may be quieter, but as I just showed you, that really accounts for very few of the conversation problems that we see in families living with Parkinson's disease. It is a much broader issue than that. And so this isn't just the Parkinson's disease itself. It isn't just the person with Parkinson's disease job to fix their problem. This really is an entire family communication unit issue. Everyone has to do their part to understand these challenges, to help build bridges, and to help scaffold for success. I want to thank, as I wrap up here, my incredible lab for all the work that they do. So at any given time, this is a small version of our group. We have between 30 and 40 students, some of who are funded by the Parkinson's Foundation and other groups to do research in Parkinson's disease. We train physicians who go out to become movement disorders neurologists, and we train scientists who go out to work in this field, and we train speech language pathologists to go out and do a better job of working with people with Parkinson's disease. And lastly, we do a lot of our studies both virtually and in person. So this audience would have a little bit of trouble traveling to Chicago to see me, but we certainly have lots of opportunities to participate in studies virtually. If you're ever interested in supporting some of our work, we'd love to have the opportunity to meet you. I'm going to wrap up there, and I know Katelyn has some great questions kind of in the chat box that we want to talk about. And I really just want to take this opportunity again to thank you so much for having me today, and hope that you found this of value.
Thank you, Dr. Roberts. That was fantastic presentation, incredibly thorough, and I can tell by the questions that have come in that we've had that a lot of people are very interested in the information, and it's really hitting home for them. So we are going to take about a 5-minute break so that I can go through these questions, kind of combine them, condense them, and then we will come back live with Dr. Roberts, and we'll be able to get all of your questions answered. So there is still time to submit your questions if you have them. Please put them through the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and that way I'll be able to access them. Welcome back. We are now going to get to the questions that you all in the audience have submitted through today's live session. So there's a lot of very good ones. I want to remind people a couple of things. One, if you need to access the presentation and the program from today, you can either go through the website, hapsonline.org, the summer lecture series page, and it will say click there to download the program for today's event. Or if you go back to the email that you were sent that has the logo with a fun summer background, you'll see that there is at the bottom of the email is a link where it says to click here to download the handouts for today. So you can find them there. And we've had a couple questions about whether or not people can share this presentation with their family members so that they too can better understand. And of course you can. This presentation will be archived and will be stored on the HAPS YouTube channel once we get that up. And so you can certainly share a link to that as well. So, okay, I'm going to start going through some of these questions. And I'm going to start with a question that I think is particularly pertinent given all that we're dealing with the COVID pandemic. And the question was related to how do we deal with, communication when wearing a face mask? How do we get around those? As I know some of our groups are going back in person, our support groups, and we're still requiring masks as a lot of places are, but do you have any suggestions or thought about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So before I answer that, so Katelyn, I'll just also highlight, I had the honor of kind of co-authoring a Parkinson's Foundation kind of booklet on cognition and communication back a few years ago. So some of what we talked about today is also in that, and it carries the flavor of what we talked about today. So if people are interested in additional information to share with friends and family, that's one other kind of source to get it, in addition to the wonderful resources that HAPS has. So I just wanted to kind of make sure that was clear. So with regard to the mask wearing, we've been dealing a lot with this in our groups as well. And, there are a couple of options that we have found to be successful. Again, I think this is inherently a challenge, especially for people with Parkinson's disease. And we have talked about the challenge in our community specifically around, especially early on in the kind of closing and the precautions, because there really were not additional adaptive masks that people could use. But there are a couple of things that you can use. Even if you search on Amazon and with a little bit of digging, you'll be able to find masks that actually have open, so they are fully cover the face. So it's not a face shield. So they actually go on like a regular mask, but this opening spot around the mouth is actually a see-through material. And those can be incredibly helpful. And I advocate for anyone who loves someone with Parkinson's disease to get them a couple of those masks. And I've been really trying to push even some of the local Parkinson's chapters who are going back in person to go ahead and purchase some of those masks to make that their standing masks that are at the door, so that we advocate for people with Parkinson's disease. But those can be really helpful because then you can still see the eyes, but you can also see mouth movements. Now, that does not support one of the challenges of just having something covering the mouth, which further dampens the speech and makes it harder to understand. But that's also where we've been advocating for just better kind of conversation rules. So ensuring that if you've got multiple people in a group, so Katelyn, you described kind of coming back into support group format. If you've got that scenario, just really make sure people are taking turns. You don't have people talking over one another. You might also use a microphone, whereas you might not normally do that for people to hold as they're going around a room. These kind of pocket devices, pocket speech amplification devices can also be helpful. Some of them are pretty cost effective, if even for the short term, to wear with your mask, just so it's amplifying your voice a little bit further. So for us, it's a combination of technologies that seem to be making that work. But I think in these cases, that's where it's also incredibly important to even be more diligent with these rules of saying, I need more time, or did you understand me, to make sure that those messages are getting across before people move along. So I'm not sure that helps for us. We have found it's a combination of adding microphones, using these see-through masks, and just really being even more careful than we might be normally to these kind of good rules of conversation.
Wonderful, thank you. I think I was making myself some notes so that we can, as a team, talk about how we might be able to address this as our groups are coming back in and people are coming and being able to participate even in speech therapy or just in support groups. And so I think those are some really great suggestions that we can use even here locally at HAPS and with our programs that people can also then use at home.
For sure. Yeah, I think a great care package gift, right? Sharpies, index cards, a Zoom account, and see-through masks.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Okay, any other question? I mean, there were questions about any other issues associated with the pandemic that you've seen related to communication issues.
Yeah, I'll touch on a couple of these that I think I'm going to put them on radar, but I'm not sure we have great solutions for them, but things I'm hearing from the community, right? They include kind of aspects of changes in cognition for people who have had COVID. And there is some research going on in this area right now, not just specific to people with Parkinson's disease, but to the community in general. And so this notion of kind of prolonged cognitive fogginess, or this feeling of kind of thinking thickness that people are describing, might actually be a very real thing. And you just want to keep in communication with your physician about that, both your Parkinson's disease doctor and your general doctor. Whether or not that's having a disproportionate effect on people with Parkinson's disease, I'm not sure we know that. But it is an interesting phenomenon that, especially given our fears of kind of dementia and cognitive decline and Parkinson's disease that a lot of people live with, their concerns, that it's just to raise that. So far, we don't know that this is leading to long-term changes, but the changes are certainly at least intermediate, right? They're not something that goes away as soon as you have the virus, and they do seem to be lasting several months. But whether or not they are permanent changes in the risk of developing dementia, we don't know that. But I'll address it because it does come up pretty often when I have these conversations. The other one, and I got this question recently actually from the Parkinson's Foundation, so we were working through that, is the long-term effects on swallowing. So I know it's a little bit different than communication, but certainly falls still within my professional realm. But this notion of, if I've had COVID, this kind of prolonged challenge with swallowing or persistent changes in loss of smell. And so we also know hyposmia or difficulty smelling can be part of Parkinson's disease symptoms, but it does seem to be exaggerated in people who have had COVID. So prolonged issues in swallowing, again, if you're having challenges with that, don't let that mask perhaps Parkinson's disease changes. Swallowing changes are common in Parkinson's disease. I would not let that one go. I would, if you're having some challenges swallowing and you think it's just left over from COVID, don't kind of fall down that path. I would go ahead and see a speech pathologist and have your swallowing evaluated. It could be prolonged from COVID, especially if you required, having some form of intubation when you were recovering. But it could also just be the Parkinson's disease itself. And so that's not one I would put off. But those are kind of the major questions that we're getting.
Okay, thank you for that. So my follow-up question, since you brought up the swallowing issues, there were a couple of questions that people had, is if you have speech problems, if you already notice, or if you're noticing problems with speech, is that inherent that you will also have swallowing issues? Do those two things always go hand in hand?
So great question. They don't always go hand in hand, but they often both co-occur in Parkinson's disease. So, swallowing impairments and speech impairments are pretty ubiquitous. What we kind of think about as being ubiquitous symptoms in Parkinson's disease at some point in time in your journey. The severity of those varies widely across people. The progression and speed of progression varies widely across people. But the fact that they both tend to occur in Parkinson's disease is just kind of one of the facts of Parkinson's disease. So some people will develop swallowing issues that remain relatively mild throughout their entire disease course, and just simply sometimes have to soften some foods or make different choices about what they choose to eat. Others, swallowing problems can become quite severe, but knowing for whom and under what conditions that happens, we still don't have a lot of information on that just in the course of the disease. But it's another area where we have lots of interventions and lots of approaches to support people with Parkinson's disease. And so it's not something to be afraid of. We have exercises, just like we have speech exercises, we have exercises for swallowing. If you're having any changes at all, go ahead and kind of get in touch with the speech pathologist, even for a baseline assessment, so that we have this kind of time point that we can follow you over time and know when we need to either put an exercise program in place or a treatment program in place. I think about speech and swallowing just like I think about, physicians monitoring your bradykinesia and rigidity and doing, your finger tapping and monitoring your rigidity at each and every assessment. I think and certainly some of the new European guidelines advocate for the fact that we need to be checking on speech and swallowing symptoms at every single clinic appointment. And it's A-okay. I saw a question in the chat about this. It's A-okay to go early just to have a baseline assessment. You may not be quite ready for intervention yet, or even ready to do what it takes for intervention yet. But having that baseline appointment, if you have any symptoms at all, you don't want to go if you don't have any symptoms. But if you're starting to have speech and swallowing symptoms, getting that intervention early, at least getting on the radar of your local speech language pathologist, having that baseline assessment, knowing what your options are is really important. And I know there's still kind of this bit of stigma around physicians waiting until there's a big problem before referring to speech language pathology services. But whether we're talking about physiotherapy for exercise, physical therapy, my Canadian comes out, whether we're talking about physical therapy for exercise, whether we're talking about speech therapy for kind of voice and swallowing issues, we know that here early intervention matters, even if that early intervention is in the form of education and counseling. And so I think this requires the Parkinson's community on broad to advocate, but then also you to have the confidence to advocate for yourself and what you feel like you need.
Thank you. I mean, that's something that we talk a lot about in most of our programs and support groups and educational sessions. It's really talking about that being proactive, being your best self-advocate. The thought that most of this stuff can be done kind of prehabilitative rather than rehabilitative.
Yes. But it's super hard when your physician says it's not time, right? And it's even harder. It's even harder when you go see a physical therapist or a speech therapist. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, Katelyn. No. From my perspective, it gets really challenging because I go on the road and tell people this is what they should be doing. And then they meet with a physical therapist or a speech therapist who says, well, you're really too early for us to do anything. So, we have education to do on multiple prongs here, right? We have education of people living with these conditions. Our societies have a role in educating, but then, we also need to educate the professionals working with you, be they physicians or physical therapists or speech therapists, to understand that, no, this is actually something we can do about. And so you may have to advocate on two fronts, advocate for yourself with your neurologist, but also advocate for yourself even with the rehab professional that you're seeing to say, no, I know there's something you can do here, or here's what I want from you. But that's a really tough process to kind of go through. Sometimes it can be really frustrating. So if you run into someone who doubts, you give them my email and tell them to email me and I'll do my best to set them straight. I get a lot of those.
Good. That's perfect. That's perfect. What a great resource, because I know that a lot of times people feel where they're the first place of resistance, I guess I should say, is maybe at the neurologist's office.
For sure.
Says, you're too early. You don't need to worry about this. You don't have a problem. Your voice is very strong. And so then they don't know what to say as a response to that.
Sure.
We really encourage people to be their best advocates and to be able to say, it's just a prescription. All you have to do is write it. And it's really not that big of a deal. So, and what does it hurt to go get a baseline? And I'm a big believer in that, but not all, it's harder to convince physicians to.
It's really tough, but we're getting there. We are getting there, right? And there are more and more, the new Canadian guidelines, the European Parkinson's Disease Association guidelines, actually the AAN, so the American Academy of Neurology guidelines around Parkinson's disease, all advocate for early interventions and from a rehabilitation standpoint, early and multidisciplinary interventions for people living with Parkinson's disease. So this is not just me on my soapbox. We actually have kind of national guidelines and guidances coming forward to say this based on the evidence, which you can also point them to. That can be really helpful.
Okay. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit to the hearing topic that you brought up. We have one in the Q&A and a couple questions that came to me by text where people asked if you could talk a little bit more about the hearing loss. You mentioned kind of an increased risk for people with Parkinson's and the hearing loss. And then also kind of as a follow-up to that, will most audiologists or ENTs be able to treat hearing loss of an individual with Parkinson's?
Yeah, thanks for those questions. So by full disclosure, I'm not an audiologist, although speech language pathologist and audiologist work very closely with one another. I will also, by disclosure, my husband is an audiologist and works a lot with people who have Parkinson's disease and other cognitive impairment. So this has kind of been a mission focus of ours for a while now when the research started coming out talking about risk for hearing loss in persons with Parkinson's disease. So in terms of what we know, so this is still, when I mean new as into the last couple of years, right? So you have to understand in science, there has to be this kind of crest of critical mass that says a problem is a problem, and then we start really looking at it more closely. But we do have at least a couple of population level studies, meaning looking at kind of broad clinic populations or large samples of persons living with Parkinson's disease, that seem to indicate that they are at higher risk of developing hearing loss compared to people of typical age and typical health status who do not have Parkinson's. Now, one of the things to kind of lay as background here is that hearing loss is actually the third most common chronic health condition in people over the age of 65. So period, getting older, hearing loss is common. Of those people with hearing loss, a good portion of them actually don't know that they have hearing loss. If you ask them if they have trouble hearing, they will say no, right? Their perceptual knowledge of the hearing loss or their ability to perceive it may be lower, but it is not so low that it's not interfering with communication. We actually know that it takes a very, very low level of hearing loss to perturbate or to disrupt conversations and communication. And you layer that on top of something like Parkinson's disease that already affects communication, and the impact just gets magnified. So I wanted to kind of lay that out there. So we think about, again, things like getting a hearing screening done as just part of doing a regular checkup, especially if you're 65 or older and you also have Parkinson's disease. The mechanism behind why people with hearing loss, people with Parkinson's disease seem to have more hearing loss, that part we don't understand as well yet. We also know that people with dementia are more likely to have hearing loss, and that people who have hearing loss are more likely to develop dementia, as that Lancet kind of article I went over with showed. So, you know, but exactly why the two conditions are co-occurring at kind of a cellular level in the brain, to understand kind of what's changing in the brain that's causing both to be more common, that part we're still working on, but most likely it'll involve kind of, the answer to that will be something about a common kind of underpinning vascular pathology that seems to be affecting both conditions. In terms of the treatment and management of that, again, I'm not an audiologist, so I'm going to stay very surface level on this response. But there are a variety of tools, just like we have in our speech pathology toolbox, some of which include devices such as hearing aids, some of which include non-hearing aid but still amplification devices, and others that just include a lot of communication counseling, similar to some of the strategies that I went over with you today, something we call aural rehabilitation, AURAL, that teaches people how to engage more effectively in conversations when you have changes in your hearing, whether you have a hearing aid or not. So in terms of who can address and treat this, really the hearing loss that we see in Parkinson's disease is not special. So it is just hearing loss, and as far as we know. But when you're having a hearing assessment done, it is probably important in this group to think about not just the acuity of hearing when they play tones for you to listen to, but also your ability to do speech discrimination. And not all hearing tests will include a good hearing test. A good audiology evaluation will include both what we call pure tone and speech discrimination testing. And so you want both pure tone and speech discrimination testing, because it may be that pure tone you look just fine, but the ability to discriminate speech sounds is where we first see the impairment, and that's pretty important when it comes to communicating. But really, any audiologist, maybe not always a hearing instrument practitioner, and there's lots of audiology clinics or hearing aid clinics that are run by hearing instrument practitioners, but a good audiologist of any kind will be able to do this assessment. Where we find the larger challenges is not in the assessment, but in deciding about the hearing aids themselves. And this is where I think Parkinson's disease has some special considerations. And we've actually written on this a little bit in terms of thinking about the device itself, having a remote control with larger buttons that lets you turn your hearing aid on and off without having to have the fine motor control for the small switches on a hearing aid. Working with an audiologist to find a hearing aid that's easier to insert. Working with an audiologist to find hearing aids that are rechargeable batteries that just sit on a charging pad, so you're not having to futz with taking the batteries in and out, which can be harder for people with Parkinson's disease. So the answer for me is less about who does the assessment and more about working with an audiologist who has some experience with Parkinson's disease, who can help you find a technology that's easier for you to use. Because if it's hard to use, you're not going to use it, and you're going to get rid of it. And then that's not going to be helping anyone. So that's where I would spend some more time. And if you have a great audiologist you love who doesn't know about Parkinson's disease, then you may have to provide them with some education around that. But that's the biggest challenge we find, is getting people on the right technology that's physically accessible to them given their Parkinson's disease.
Thank you. Somewhat related, the Speech 5 device, can that be used if you wear hearing aids?
Yeah, so I responded to that person directly. I'll answer it here though as well too, because I want to make sure they had that information. So it kind of depends on the hearing aid configuration. And so it's not impossible to do, but it requires a little bit of coordination between your audiologist and the speech language pathologist who's fitting you for the Speech 5. It's not impossible, but it requires a couple of extra steps for sure. But it's not impossible.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, the next set of questions, I'm really kind of condensing and combining that have more to do with relational type issues. So people who are either, do you have tips for what to say, going to a restaurant, for example, and the person at the restaurant picking up on their communication issues, and so just talking right past the person with Parkinson's and talking only to the care partner or the other person that is with them. How do you address some of those issues with other people? How do you say, you can talk to him, he's perfectly capable of answering that question in a way that people feel comfortable, that's not so confrontational?
Yeah, thank you for that. I'll extend this to say one of the areas we find this most challenging is actually at physicians' appointments, right? Where even physicians, and I don't know whether anyone on this call has had those challenges. We hear that a lot, where even when you go see your doctor, the doctor will direct comments to, your partner who doesn't have Parkinson's disease and kind of leave you out of the care discussion. Gosh, that must be so incredibly frustrating. I've not had that experience myself, but I can appreciate that would be really frustrating also. I think, Katelyn, part of, the way that we work with families on how to deal with this is, when we're working with them one-on-one, we'll also do some role playing around how to handle these situations, so people get comfortable with what we think about as being asserting agency on behalf of the person with Parkinson's disease, or even the person with Parkinson's disease themselves being comfortable saying, hey, I really appreciate you're trying to make this easy on me by talking to my partner, but I would really love to be the one to have this conversation with you, and I think sometimes that gentle reminder, just stated in a very direct but non-accusatory way, kind of reminds someone that I need to be paying attention to this person. Other lines that we've taught that seem to work well is, I know communicating with me can be challenging sometimes, and I have trouble too, but if you can be patient with me, here are some things that help me. If you look and make eye contact with me, if you give me more time, right? People with Parkinson's disease, in my experience, and their families are really creative. I've had people we've worked with come up with rules for communicating with me. And when they sit down at a family dinner at a restaurant, they just put it out for everybody. Here's the rules for how to communicate with me, right? Being a part of this conversation is so important to me, but I'm going to need your help. So here you go. And, I think different people have different comfort levels with where they are with that, but you can use humor, and different things to kind of make that conversation a little bit easier. If it's a close set of friends, you can mail that out to people. Say, gosh, I value you so much. Here's the rules for how to communicate with me. I'm going to do my best, but I'm going to need your help. Let's go for it, right? So I think that's one way of doing it. If you find it's a persistent problem, there are also, you can just call it out directly and say, I notice you're talking to me, but I know John really wants to be in this conversation. I wonder if we might switch this up a bit. Other ways that it can work really well is even how you position yourself at the table, right? So round tables work better than square tables to make sure everyone is engaged. You can, as the care partner, sometimes especially if I'm with some of my friends who have Parkinson's disease, and I find that's happening to me, every time the person directs their attention to me, I just look away and look to the person who has Parkinson's disease, and I stop making eye contact with them until they turn and do that reciprocal communication. So we as partners can do a lot, both verbally and non-verbally, that directs the behavior back to the person with Parkinson's disease, in addition to just some of those overt ways of being very direct around what you need help with.
I think that those are great tips, and I think very practical, very usable for people, should feel very comfortable. I know we also had a couple of questions from care partners who said, that their spouses or their significant others or the person that they're caring for have become really way too comfortable with having them do all the speaking for them. And they really don't want to be in that role of having to be the sole communicator. So do you have any thoughts, kind of on what you might encourage, how you might encourage care partners to be able to speak up and say? I think some of the sentiments that were expressed was, I don't want to come across as not caring, I don't want to come across as not supportive, but I also don't really want to tell the doctor everything that is happening, because I want to encourage the individual to speak for themselves.
Yeah, and these things don't happen overnight. They may feel like all of a sudden you woke up one day and you're the one who's now primarily communicating for your partner who has Parkinson's, but they really don't happen overnight. And just, these are learned behaviors. And we encounter them a lot when we start working with people who, maybe the person's been living with Parkinson's disease several years by this point in time. And we find that, these are not natural behaviors that exist in your relationship. They are ones that are developed in the context of Parkinson's disease. But just like we learn behaviors around communicating with coworkers, these are learned behaviors in the context of the communication with your partner. So I think the first thing to remember is, if they are learned behaviors, they can also be unlearned behaviors. But just like learning any bad habit, it takes a while to undo that bad habit. So I think sometimes when people think, gosh, I don't want to be in this role anymore, and I'm just going to tell the person with Parkinson's disease, I don't want to be in this role anymore, I want them to talk up for themselves more, they expect that to happen overnight, and it's not going to happen overnight. So it took a while for this behavior to get there. It's going to take a while for it to change. And so being patient with one another as you take on this course of shifting who's the primary communication partner or primary communicator in any context is the first rule to remember. The second is to sit down, and we do this. Sometimes couples have trouble having this conversation between each other. And that's where it's helpful to have someone like me or another professional kind of be a part of that conversation to say, it really isn't great that you're not advocating for yourself. That can be a social worker who's working with you. It can also be someone like me who specializes in communication strategies to say, how about we reframe how this happens, right? Your partner is really feeling burdened because he or she feels like they're having to carry the weight of those communication moments. And that makes her feel not supported, or it makes her feel like you're less of a couple in those moments. And that's emotionally hard, right? So we can actually walk through those paces to help couples readjust their communication. But if you try to have this conversation on your own, I think those are important messages to send. I want to help you. I want to do everything I can, what you need from me. But I find we've fallen into this habit that makes me feel less like an us and more like a me. And feeling like an us is still really important to me. I want to be your care partner, but I also just want to be your wife, your husband, your friend. I want to be your daughter, your son. I want to be that other person too. And for me to be that person, I need us to do this a little bit differently. Right. And you can negotiate when are those moments where your partner feels comfortable speaking from themselves and with whom they feel comfortable doing that. And those moments where they're really not comfortable. And in those moments where they really are not comfortable speaking for themselves or asserting for themselves, and we as their partners need to respect that and help to be supportive in those moments, while also changing the environment, helping to educate others so that there are more opportunities where the person with Parkinson's disease does feel comfortable. This is not an easy conversation to have, and it's not even a conversation, it is multiple conversations that you may actually require some support to have, and you're going to have to each rebuild new habits, and that takes time.
Exactly. And I think that these are things that, again, through the very long course of the disease process, I mean, it's something that just has to be revisited as things change, as things improve, as things, just everyday life and aging and everything else that comes along with
gosh,
life.
what a great point, right? It's never static. About Parkinson's disease, I mean, and we're all used to saying this. You walk into a room with 30 people with Parkinson's disease and you see 30 people with Parkinson's disease, right? No one has the same symptom profile. No one has the same trajectory. But so too is the fact that whatever strategies we find work for today, in 3 years from now, 2 years from now, 6 months from now, maybe 10 years from now, all have to be revisited. And this notion of maintaining flexibility and adaptability around each other, it's why when we work with people, we work with them in this dyad space, right? Because it is never about one person or the other, but it's about the dance that we try to get two people to do together to really optimize communication. And that means sometimes one partner's leading, sometimes the other partner is leading, but that flexibility and adaptability becomes really key. Unfortunately, when living with Parkinson's disease, the challenges in that can lead people to become less flexible in that dance, not just actually physically less flexible, but just less flexible. And we have to work to help restore some of that sometimes in the relationship. And I think these are great opportunities for support groups and great opportunities for conversations to have these very direct and pointed conversations around communication and maintaining connected and engaged, and to allow people living with Parkinson's disease and their partners to talk about what's worked for them.
Yes, and I agree. I mean, the support group aspect is a great place, a great venue to be able to share and to be able to learn from others and even practice some of these communication skills.
Absolutely.
Which is so, which is so important. But yes, every situation every person is unique, every situation is unique. So it takes creativity and
Yes.
and learning how to just kind of be accommodating and go with the flow and understand that the one thing that we can expect is change with this disease. And so we all have to be kind of open to that. Okay, I've kind of boiled down the questions to maybe 2 more because I want to be mindful of time. And this one is not exactly related to speech, but certainly communication, in that this person sent in a question that said that they are, and I'm just going to kind of paraphrase, that for work purposes and for hobby purposes, writing is a big part. Communication through writing is a big part of what they are required and what they want to do. But because of the Parkinson's and the fine motor issues, typing has become challenging. So do you have any apps or technology that you might recommend or that you have experience with that can help facilitate kind of more written communication, if you will?
Yeah, for sure. So, written communication is both language, right, and motoric. And so we often partner with our colleagues who are occupational therapists to help to solve some of these challenges. And so if you don't have an occupational therapist currently in your care system, that might be a really good person to work with. Sometimes, especially if it's in the context of work, a vocational rehab specialist may also have some helpful supports for thinking about really adapting individual work activities around some of the challenges that you're having, whether they're for cognitive reasons, communication reasons, or for fine motor control reasons. So I would encourage you to kind of expand your care network to maybe add some of those professionals in. One of the things that I will talk a little bit about some of the options that we have found to be helpful here. And of course, it depends on the exact circumstance and everyone's intervention is kind of customized to them. But there are nice adaptive keyboards these days that have been developed for people with fine motor control issues, not specifically those with Parkinson's disease. but including people with Parkinson's disease, people who have had stroke, and other conditions that tend to affect fine motor control. So there are actually really easily accessible, very affordable technologies that just adapting those may be helpful. One example is if your motor symptoms are more severe on one side than the other, and you have a more preserved side or a side that may be more responsive when you take your levodopa, then switching off to a one-handed keyboard can be really helpful. We have used, for people who still have pretty good voice, we've been able to use kind of speech to text applications, or a combination of one-handed keyboards and speech to text, both for phone and for work-based purposes. There are a couple of speech to text software programs that work a little bit better for people with Parkinson's disease, and I can share those links with Katelyn, and she can share them out to the community. There are also some adaptable pens that can make writing a bit easier for people with Parkinson's disease. So I think, expanding out that rehab network to people who specifically focus on job-based tasks, such as OT or vocational rehab, and then knowing that it may take a combination of solutions, but there should be something that can be helpful here.
Okay, sounds great. Thank you for that. And I'll look for that list, because I know people will be interested in it, and I know that it will be helpful. So
they're not
okay,
perfect. They work better.
I'm sorry, say that again.
I said they're not perfect, but they do work a little bit better. We test a lot of these in our labs to try to find ones that work best for people with Parkinson's. So we've got a little bit of an idea, but none of them are really perfect.
Yeah, and I noticed that since as some of the ergonomically designed equipment has been developed and kind of evolved over the years, that has been more helpful for people with Parkinson's than what we had years ago. So
well, it's true. And it's also the native apps built into phones, right? So both Android and Apple now have ways of adjusting the keyboard so that if your finger stays there longer, it doesn't do a duplicate key entry, right? Or you can actually slide across the letters instead of having to lift your hand up and go to each letter separately. So that's where having someone do a customized evaluation of exactly what the fine motor issues are. Some of these they don't even require buying new technologies, but simply optimizing the settings within existing smart technologies to really meet your needs.
Yes. Okay, I'm going to go with final question here, and that is, do you have, a couple people said that they find that part of the difficulty that they have with the speech or the loudness or maintaining it is primarily the breath support behind it, that they get fatigued. So do you have any techniques for building breath support? And then there was another question about, do you have top 3 mouth exercises that you recommend that people do daily, or someone said weekly, so maybe they're looking for just a weekly fix, but it sounds like maybe it's daily.
Yeah, so I will sound like a broken record here to say it depends and maybe. And so I think that it depends is that there's no really, I would argue that there's no such thing as kind of a perfect 3 exercises. It really depends on the nature of your issue with Parkinson's disease. Although, if we're thinking about general exercises, just really thinking about opening your mouth widely and doing some mirror practice can really be helpful. So even just reading maybe a morning news article out loud, but really watching yourself in the mirror and trying to open your mouth broadly so that you're stretching your jaw and really giving your tongue the opportunity to kind of stretch through the sounds can be helpful. And you can work that into any activity that you're doing. You can do that with a mirror so that you have some indication of your mouth getting smaller with time, which it will do as you're reading over a paragraph, and then just really making a mindfulness to kind of open your mouth as wide as you can. I think in doing those types of exercises, the notion is not that when you're out communicating with people that you're doing this very exaggerated mouth opening, but it's that kind of by doing that each day, you're kind of recalibrating what your mouth judges as being open enough, right? And that open enough is where we often find the challenge in Parkinson's disease. The loud enough is where we find the challenge. It's not that the muscles are not capable of doing those movements. It's that your brain tricks you into thinking the smaller movements are actually enough when they're not. And so this notion of kind of recalibrating every day can be helpful. In terms of breath support, we have to be a little cautious here. There are some people that if they're not taught how to use breath support properly, actually will end up putting too much strain on their vocal cords. So the vocal cords are the little muscles that come together that vibrate like guitar strings. And when air goes across them and they vibrate, and then you shape it by your mouth, that's what makes our speech sounds. So think about plucking a guitar and the sound that comes off of that, that is your voice. And then we shape that towards speech sounds using our tongue, our lips, our teeth. So that's the speech system. If you are doing respiratory or voice strengthening exercises without having some guidance in those, what tends to happen is people put too much strain on these guitar strings, your vocal cords, and that can actually lead to damage to the vocal cords. They can cause them to become too thick. It can cause them to actually develop polyps or nodules that then keep the vocal cords from closing. So there's a real risk with people who have Parkinson's disease, because the respiratory system or the breathing support can be affected, that when they start to do these exercises, if they're not careful, it can actually put too much strain on this part of the system and create damage. So if you're going to kind of, easy exercises for all of us to think about are making sure before we talk that you take a deep breath. And again, if you think you've taken a breath that's deep enough, then take a little bit more breath, right? Because it's probably, remember, Parkinson's disease plays that trick and tells you you've taken in a large enough breath when you haven't. So really thinking about doing deep breathing exercises, taking a big breath before you speak, breaking down phrases. If you're reading sentences out loud for practice in the morning, then breaking those into shorter sentences and taking a breath in the middle of them, so that you're keeping this constant breath support flowing. If you're doing that and opening your mouth a bit more widely and trying to articulate more in a more exaggerated or clear fashion, you're going to notice your voice is going to be louder and you're going to have the breath support to do that. But that said, if you're going to really look at doing high intensity exercises like singing or being really loud or stretching up a pitch scale and coming back down as part of your exercises, you might want to see a speech pathologist first to make sure you're doing that in a way that's healthy for your vocal cords and you're not creating more issues. In terms of the issue of weekly versus daily, absolutely daily. And I hate to say it, and I'm sorry to say it, but it's the case. Think about this like a recalibration or a retuning every day for your brain and your speech muscles, and it needs to be daily.
Right. Just like all exercise that we should be doing, and specifically for people with Parkinson's, to keep moving, keep joints going, and help improve mood and other things.
Keep
right?
engaging, keep talking, volunteer,
right.
Find something that you do that is of interest to you. None of us want to talk if we don't have anything to talk about, right? So getting out, being active, volunteering for something new, stretching your comfort zone, all those things are not only good for your cognition, they give you something to talk about, which means when you're in a conversation, you have something to practice with your skills. If we're not doing anything and we're sitting at home, then we don't have anything to talk about, right? So I think part of maintaining activity and an active lifestyle and doing more, even though it is tough and I can appreciate that, is also part of that engaging piece. So
absolutely. And I think that's maybe the biggest lesson that we've learned over the course of COVID is in how important engagement and connection really is to daily life and quality and just, how we're navigating everything. So I just want to take this moment on behalf of all of our clients and all the people that tuned in to say thank you so much, Dr. Roberts, for being a part of today's presentation and for all of the information that you shared. This was just an excellent presentation, full of great information, but also just lots of practical tips. And I think that's what people value so much is the takeaway, the take home that they can go and practice and really apply to daily life with Parkinson's. And so that makes this just an incredibly valuable session. So thank you again for joining us today.
Thanks, and thanks for your time and for the great questions. It was lovely to meet all of you.
Yes, thank you. All right. And, Chicago's looking really tropical these days, so we might all have to take a trip there. Yeah,
it is. Take care, everyone.
All right. Thank you again.
Bye-bye.
Okay, so that wraps up our question and answer session, along with the entire program for today, the educational part of our program. So thank you to all of you who submitted such great questions. Next up is the Movement Lab with Katelyn Blankenburg. If you're not able to stick around and move with us, I want to take a minute to thank you for joining us and to again thank our sponsors for their generous support of today's program and all of our educational programs. As I mentioned earlier, this session will be available online in the coming weeks. Don't forget to check out what's going on on our website for the latest information on in-person classes, because we do have in-person classes going, as well as online exercise sessions. And then we do have our third and final summer lecture series happening in August, and then our biennial educational symposium scheduled for September 18th. So now we are going to jump over to Katelyn Blankenburg, who is going to lead us in a very exciting session on drumming. Katelyn is a board certified music therapist and neurologic music therapist. She completed her bachelor's degree in music therapy at Sam Houston State University and her master's of music therapy at Loyola University in New Orleans. Katelyn is the owner and clinical director of Texas Music Therapy Services, LLC, and serves on the board of the Southwest region of American Music Therapy Association. Katelyn may look very familiar to you all, as she has instructed many HAPS therapeutic exercise and enrichment classes over the years. So take it away, Katelyn.
Hello, my name is Katelyn. I'm the owner of Texas Music Therapy Services, and I'm here to show you a little bit about what drumba is like. So for this, you'll need 3 zones. I'm using pillows, but you don't have to use anything at all. And I'm using drumsticks. You can use spoons, you can use pencils, you can use your hands. What's most important is that we get moving, get grooving. Alrighty, we are just about to start. Here we go. Start with some big movements. All right, we're gonna go side to side. 3, 2, 1. 4, 1, 2, 3, All right, back to the middle. Back to the side. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. in the middle. Good job. So side to side for 4 on each one. 3, 2, 1. Woo, very nice. All right, now that we're all warmed up, let's get on to the next one. All right, here we go. Out, in. Out, in. Up and down, up and down. Add those feet in there if you can. Here I go again, Mama, how can I resist you? Mama, just show again, Mama, just how much I miss you. Yes, I'm broken hearted. It's so sweet. Out and in. Did I ever let you go? Mama, I can never let you go. All right, other side out. In. Out, in. Out, in. All right, forward. At those feet. Here I go again, Mama, how can I resist you? Mamma mia, doesn't show again, Mama, just how much I miss you. Yes, I'm broken hearted, losing the day you wanted. You need to go slower, that's okay. Mama, I could never let you go. Back to the middle, out and in. Here we go. All right, we're gonna go down and click. Get some kicks in there. Get those feet moving. If you can't kick your feet, raise those toes. If you need to sit, that's okay too. You put them low if you need to put them low. Try to get those shoulders up. picking on me. Backstroke. Somebody else's heart. You got me jumping at the crazy clouds. And I don't think you want to put him down. Kisses and kisses, my lips are wild. In the follows me, is that I like fun. Hey, hey, set me free. Stupid, good, stop thinking on me. Quick! Jumping like a crazy cloud, and I don't think you want you put down. Since I used to love and live so wide, the thing that bothers me is that I like it fine. Hey, hey, set me free. Stupid goop, stop picking on me. Swim! You makes me want to go fast, we're giving you. Somebody else's heart. Barry's gonna jump like the crazy clouds. And I don't think you want to put down. Since I used to love and live so wide, the thing that bothers me is that I like it fine. Hey, hey, set me free. Stupid goop, stop picking on me. Hey, hey, set me free. Stupid goop, stop picking on me. Very nice. Woo! All right, we are almost done. Almost done. All right. We're going to do some shuffling for this one. Side to side. All right, middle. We're gonna go around like this, okay? Back to shuffle. She got a crack. I'm alone, I need blast. I see the light, she'll let me drown. It's a life of election. Keep it going.
So we're going into that cave.
We've been strolling just the night.
So we're going into that cave. We went out under the dark.
We stayed up till 10 o'clock. We stayed up till 10
All
o'clock.
right, around.
I'm afraid, don't get afraid.
The sun alive.
Go the other way.
Sounds like a dress.
All right, back to the middle. Good job.
Like it. Yeah.
There we go. Just do some side steps. We're going for a long time now.
She
All
was
right,
afraid
out,
to come out of the
in.
locker. She was as nervous as she could be. She was afraid to come out of the locker. She was afraid of somebody could see.
Other side.
What you want.
It was a teeny weeny yellow bikini that she was born the first time today. A teeny weeny yellow bikini, so in the water she wanted to stay. 2, 3, 4, take around the tell
She was afraid to come out of the open. And so I anchored around her. She was. She
Other
was
side.
afraid to come out in the open. And so she sat bottled up in her shoe.
2, 3, 4, tell the people what
Let's
you
go
want.
forward and back.
Teeny weeny yellow bikini that she will hold the first time today. Teeny weeny yellow bikini.
for this mini drumba. I hope to see you in future classes and have a great summer. Bye.
All right, that was quite the workout. Thank you, Katelyn. Well, that is a wrap for the 2021 July session of the HAPS Summer Lecture Series. We look forward to seeing you back online and here again in August for our next summer session. As a reminder, HAPS is always here to help, so please reach out and have a great day.